In the annals of music history, some stories are written in light, and others are whispered in the shadows. The gospel world is built on truth, yet some of its greatest architects live a profound secret. Rumors swirled, clues were hidden in plain sight, but in a different time, the truth was too dangerous to speak. Now we look back at the lives of 15 pioneers who mastered their art, and mastered the art of disguise. 1.
I'll meet my Lord.
Willie Mayford Smith's voice was a seismic event. It didn't just sing, it testified. It didn't just perform, it prophesied. From the pulpits and stages where she stood, a formidable presence in a dignified dress and hat. She unleashed a sound that could cradle a sinner's fear or shatter a saint's complacency. She was the architect of gospel music, one of the very pillars upon which the mighty edifice was built. Her legacy is often measured in the stars she mentored, in her foundational role with the National Convention of Gospel Choirs and Choruses, and in her electrifying presence in the beloved documentary, Say Amen Somebody, where her performance of Jesus is Here remains a masterclass in spiritual conveyance. But to understand the full weight of her song, one must listen for quiet, steady harmony that underpinned it all, the story of a private love that provided the rhythm to her very public life. This story is inextricably linked to Ruth Baby Jones, the woman who sat at the piano, her fingers finding the chords that would lift Willie Mae's voice toward the heavens. To the audiences who flocked to see the great evangelist, Ruth was the accompanist, a vital but background figure in the spectacle of Willie Mae's ministry. But backstage, in the close quarters of a shared tour bus, in the quiet of a rented room after the last amen had been shouted, theirs was a different reality. For decades, their lives were woven together in a tapestry of mutual devotion that those in their inner circle understood for what it was. A marriage in everything but the name the law or the church would allow. It was a partnership forged on a rocky road of the gospel circuit, a life of long journeys, modest offerings, and the relentless pursuit of spreading the word. In that world, where comfort was scarce and judgment could be swift, they were each other's home. Ruth was more than just a piano player. She was a confidant, the steady hand after a draining performance, the logistical mastermind, and the keeper of the flame. Their relationship spoke a language of its own, understood in the subtle glances exchanged during rehearsal, in the effortless way they moved around each other in a small kitchen, in a shared history that needed no explanation. 2.
This train, you got to get off.
Sister Rosetta Tharpe was more than just a name in a long history of gospel and early rock. She was a force, a fire, a voice that reshaped what music could sound like and who could be seen holding a guitar. Born in 1915, she grew up steeped in church music, a little girl who carried her mother's ambition and her own extraordinary gift. By the time she was a young woman, she was not only singing the gospel but bending it, blending it, making it leap with rhythms that would lay the foundation for what we now call rock and roll. Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, so many who came later carried her sound in their bones, whether they admitted it or not. But Rosetta's story is more complicated, more layered than the myth of a pioneering guitar slinger. She was married several times to men, marriages that were public and often short-lived, but behind the spotlight, in the quieter corners of her life, she loved women too. Among the most important was Marie Knight, her singing partner in the late 1940s. On stage, they were dazzling, two women harmonizing with a blend so smooth it could hush or electrify a crowd. Off stage, they shared an intimacy that went beyond the music, a closeness that was felt by those who worked with them and whispered about in industry. Their relationship unfolded in an era when the church world and the wider world had no room for open acknowledgement of love between women, especially not women who carried the weight of gospel music on their shoulders. And yet, in spite of the secrecy, there was a kind of boldness in the way they lived, traveling together, performing together, moving through the world as a pair. Rosetta never fit into the narrow lines people tried to draw for her. She was too much, too talented, too flamboyant, too uncontainable, to be reduced to the role society wanted. When she died in 1973, her star had dimmed in the mainstream, but the echoes of her guitar still rang in every riff that came after. Today she is remembered as the godmother of rock and roll, a title that only partly captures her power. She was also a woman who loved as widely and deeply as she played, who defied convention not only with her music, but with her heart. To understand Rosetta Tharpe is to understand that history often hides its most revolutionary truths in whispers, in glances, in the spaces between songs, and it is only now that we are learning to listen more closely. 3. Roberta Martin was not just a pianist or a choir director. She was a movement unto herself, a quiet revolution in the world of gospel music. Born in 1907, she came of age in an era when black church music was already rich with tradition, but she brought something new, a polish, a discipline, a sound that was as tender as it was commanding. When she founded the Roberta Martin Singers in the 1930s, she shaped more than just a group. She created a model for the modern gospel ensemble, one that blended sophistication with soul, and in doing so, she influenced countless artists who followed. Her touch at the piano was delicate, yet purposeful. She had the ability to make a choir swell like a river, and then with a single note, bring everything back to a hush that felt like prayer. Under her direction, the Roberta Martin Singers became one of the most important gospel groups in history, known for their impeccable harmonies and emotional depth. It wasn't just music, it was ministry, it was artistry, it was life poured into song. But Martin's story was also defined by a quieter kind of devotion, one not shouted from pulpits or printed on record sleeves. For more than 3 decades, she shared her home and her life with Josephine Davis, one of the singers in her group. Their partnership was an open secret to those who knew them, an anchor in both the storms and the triumphs of Martin's career. While others came and went, Davis remained by her side, the steady presence who helped sustain both the household and the demanding world of gospel performance. In a time when such relationships could not be publicly named, they built a life together nonetheless, one woven into the very fabric of Martin's music. That sense of deep companionship, of enduring partnership, can be heard in the way her arrangements carried both strength and gentleness, as though she understood intimately what it meant to be supported, to be seen. Roberta Martin passed away in 1969, but the foundation she laid remains unshakable. Every gospel choir that strives for excellence, every pianist who blends precision with passion, carries a piece of her legacy. And behind the music, there is also the story of 2 women who quietly made a life together, whose partnership gave shape and meaning to the songs that continue to move hearts today. For James Cleveland's voice was gravelly, unmistakable, the kind of voice that seemed to carry the weight of every sorrow and every hallelujah ever uttered in a church pew. Born in 1931, he rose from the south side of Chicago to become the king of gospel music, and the title was no exaggeration. As a composer, pianist, and arranger, he transformed gospel from a strictly church-centered tradition into a sweeping, sophisticated sound that could fill concert halls and reach across the airwaves. He founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America, wrote and arranged hundreds of songs, and nurtured an entire generation of gospel talent, from Albertina Walker to the Hawkins family. His fingerprints are everywhere in the music. But James Cleveland's story was never just about his achievements. It was also about the contradictions he carried and the secrets he lived within plain sight, within the gospel world. It was widely known that he was a gay man, though the word was rarely spoken out loud. He never declared it publicly, and yet his manner, his relationships, his presence all but said it without words. In the black church, where gospel music found both its roots and its greatest audiences, this knowledge lived in a strange tension, acknowledged, whispered, denied, and yet never fully confronted. When Cleveland died in 1991, the cause, age-related complications, brought that tension into the open in a way it had never been before. For some, his death was a scandal, a moment of judgment and finger-pointing. For others, it was a tragedy that exposed the deep hypocrisy of a church that leaned on queer musicians, directors, and singers to build its sound, even as it condemned their existence from the pulpit. His passing forced conversations that many would prefer to avoid about sexuality, about silence, about the fragile line between what was celebrated in public and hidden in private. And yet, in the years since, his legacy has only grown. The power of his arrangements, the artistry of his choirs, The way he made gospel music both grand and intimate remains unmatched. To listen to James Cleveland is to hear a man who carried contradictions but poured them into music that uplifted millions. He was, like so many of the pioneers of gospel, more complicated than image allowed. And in that complication lies a truth the church is still learning to reckon with, that some of its greatest voices belong to those that refuse to fully embrace. 5.
Lord, Lord, you've been so good to me. He saved my soul. Yeah.
Alex Bradford was a blaze of energy every time he walked onto a stage. Born in 1927 in Alabama, he carried himself with a charisma that was impossible to miss, a mix of gospel fervor and theatrical flair that set him apart from nearly everyone around him. He wasn't just a singer, he was a force of personality, a showman, a writer of songs that burned with conviction. He could lift a congregation to its feet with a thunderous chorus, and then turn around and pen music that would ripple far beyond the church walls, influencing artists from Little Richard to Ray Charles. Bradford was mentored by Mahalia Jackson, who recognized in him both talent and a kind of fearlessness. He had a flamboyance that couldn't be hidden, a way of presenting himself that defied the strict codes of how a gospel man was supposed to look, speak, or move within the entertainment world. He was known to be gay and didn't shy away from it in private or among peers. He is remembered for once saying, with his typical mix of humor and defiance, "I know I'm as queer as a $3 bill, but I never let it hold me back." In an era when silence was a rule and denial the norm, Bradford's openness, even if quiet compared to today's standards, was radical. Still, the gospel audience that adored him was never confronted directly with this truth. To them, he was a dynamic choir leader, the voice behind songs like Too Close to Heaven, the composer whose work would even make its way into Broadway hit Your Arms Too Short to Box with God. The church pews saw the brilliance, the music, the soul-saving fire, while the man behind it lived with more complexity than many were ready to name. Bradford's life was short. He died in 1978, just 50 years old, but his reach was long. His music shaped the sound of gospel and, by extension, the sound of rock and soul. His courage in being himself, even in limited ways, carved a small but vital space for authenticity in a world that demanded conformity. He laughed at the idea of hiding, lived as he pleased within the circles that would accept him, and let his brilliance speak louder than anyone's judgment. In that sense, Alex Bradford was not only a gospel great, but also a pioneer of another kind, an artist who refused to shrink, even when the world insisted he should. 6. Clara Ward was a star in every sense of the word, a woman whose charisma and musical brilliance made her one of the most recognizable faces of gospel during its golden age. Born in 1924 in Philadelphia, she rose to fame as a dynamic leader of the famous Ward Singers, a group that helped bring gospel music to stages and audiences far beyond the church. Clara had a magnetism that pulled people in, her style, her voice, her showmanship, and she wasn't afraid to take gospel into places where it had never been before, blending the sacred with the sensational in ways that thrilled some and scandalized others. But her story was never just about the music. At the heart of her life were the women who stood beside her, both personally and professionally. In the early years of the Ward Singers, she shared a romantic relationship with Marion Williams, the powerhouse contralto whose voice could shake rafters. Their bond was well known within the group, and though not spoken publicly, it was deeply felt in the way they moved and sang together. When Marion eventually left the group, their relationship shifted, but the mark it left on both women lingered. Later, Clara's life took an even bolder turn. She entered into a partnership with Willie Saunders, her manager, with whom she lived openly. In an era when such a move risked reputation, livelihood, and respectability, Clara chose authenticity. Willow was not only her business partner, but also her companion, and together they navigated the complex, often unforgiving world of gospel music. Their partnership was an act of courage, one that spoke to Clara's unwillingness to hide the truths of her own life, even as the church world around her demanded silence. Clara Ward's death in 1973 cut short a life lived with a rare combination of brilliance and defiance. She left behind a musical legacy that shaped gospel and influenced artists across genres, but she also left behind a personal legacy of boldness, of choosing love and partnership on our own terms. To remember Clara is to remember not only the star on stage, but the woman who, in her private life, dared to live openly at a time when so many could not. 7. Reverend Walter Hawkins was a voice of warmth and uplift, a man whose music carried both the intimacy of prayer and the grandeur of full gospel choir. Born in Oakland in 1949, he grew up in a family whose name would become synonymous with gospel excellence. Alongside his brother Edwin Hawkins, he helped shape a new era of gospel in the late 1960s and 70s, bringing fresh sounds and modern sensibilities that would resonate far beyond church walls. When Walter recorded the Love Alive series, he wasn't just making records. He was creating soundtracks of faith, joy, and hope that would define a generation of worship. Songs like Going Up Yonder became anthems, woven into funerals, homegoings, and moments of deep spiritual longing. Yet Hawkins' life was not only about what he gave from the pulpit and the stage. Within the gospel world, it was no secret that he had relationships with men. In a community where such truths were often buried, Hawkins lived with a quiet authenticity that became more visible as time went on. He didn't use a microphone to announce his private life, but he didn't fully deny it either. Those who worked with him, those who moved in the same circles, knew. What made Walter Hawkins remarkable was not just that truth, but how it shaped the way he ministered. As he grew older, his message expanded to embrace a vision of God's love that was wide enough to hold everyone. He officiated same-sex unions, a radical gesture within the black church, and preached not from judgment but from compassion. His ministry reflected the same qualities that infuse his music: tenderness, inclusivity, a belief in the healing power of love. When he died in 2010, the loss was felt across the gospel world and beyond. His music continues to soar in sanctuaries and in private moments of grief and joy, carrying his message forward. Walter Hawkins' legacy rests not only in the beauty of the songs he left behind, but also in the example he set. That faith and authenticity can coexist, that love is greater than fear, and that a life of service to God can also be a life of honesty and courage. 8. Twinkie Clark is gospel royalty, a living legend whose fingerprints are all of the sound of modern gospel music. As the chief songwriter, arranger, and musical genius behind the Clark sisters, she has been called the Queen of the B3 organ, an innovator whose chords, progressions, and arrangements push gospel into bold new territory. Born in 1954 to the formidable Dr. Mattie Moss Clark, she grew up in a household where music was both discipline and destiny. By the time the Clark sisters burst onto the national scene, Twinkie's gifts were undeniable. Her compositions like You Brought the Sunshine carried gospel into mainstream radio, bridging the sacred and the popular in a way few had ever managed. Yet beyond the brilliance of her musicianship, Twinkie has lived with a quietness that often stands in contrast to her dazzling creativity. For decades, her sexual orientation has been the subject of conversation within gospel circles and LGBTQ+ spaces alike. It has never been spoken publicly by her, but has long been regarded as an open secret, whispered about in green rooms, rehearsals, and communities that knew how to read between the lines. In a world where gospel music and church culture often collided with rigid expectations, Twinkie chose privacy, keeping her personal life her own while pouring every ounce of emotion into her music. Her silence on the matter has not diminished the speculation, but has protected the sacred space she carved for herself. One defined not by labels but by songs, by the resonance of her organ, by the brilliance of arrangements that remain unmatched. For many, her life embodies the complexity of being both a pillar of the church and a woman whose very existence challenges the narrowness of the church's gaze. Today, Twinkie Clark stands as one of gospel's greatest living musicians, revered for her innovation and her influence. Her legacy is not only in the countless artists she has inspired, but also in the way she has held her truth with quiet dignity. Whether or not she ever speaks publicly about her personal life, what cannot be denied is that she has lived authentically on her own terms, letting the music tell the story the words never did. 9. Patrick Henderson was one of those rare musicians whose fingerprints can be found across gospel, R/B and B in pop, even if his name wasn't always at the forefront. A gifted pianist, producer, and music director, he worked with giants, Andre Crouch, the Winans, Whitney Houston, and helped shape the soundtracks of both sanctuaries and stadiums. His work earned Grammy Awards and respect from some of the biggest voices in the industry. But beyond the accolades, Henderson was a connector, someone who knew how to draw the best out of singers and choirs, how to take raw emotion and polish it into brilliance without losing its soul. In his professional life, Henderson was openly gay. Among colleagues, artists, and industry insiders, it was not a hidden truth, though it was rarely the subject of interviews or public conversations. He belonged to a generation of gospel and gospel-adjacent artists who lived in the tension between their identity and the strictures of the church, carving out space to exist authentically without making declarations that could jeopardize careers or relationships. Henderson carried that balance with a kind of quiet confidence, choosing to let his work speak loudest while still refusing to erase himself. That balance was not without its challenges. Gospel music has long depended on the genius of queer artists while simultaneously struggling to reconcile their presence. Henderson embodied that contradiction, but refused to be diminished by it. He built a career at the highest levels of excellence, leaving behind a body of work that stands as a testament to both his artistry and his perseverance. Patrick Henderson's legacy rests in more than the music he helped bring to life. It lives also in the courage of his example, the way he navigated worlds that so often stood in conflict, and the way he showed that identity and calling do not cancel each other out. For the many who followed him, musicians, singers, and producers wrestled with their own truths. His life offered a quiet but powerful reminder that it was possible to be both fully yourself and fully committed to the music you were born to make. Reverend James Moore was one of gospel's most commanding voices, a singer whose power seemed to rise from the very depths of his being. Born in Detroit in 1956, he grew up surrounded by the music of the church, and by the time he was a young man, his gift was undeniable. When he sang, "I Don't Feel No Ways Tired," it wasn't just a performance, it was testimony, a cry of resilience that could lift weary hearts and remind people of God's sustaining strength. Moore had the rare ability to make a congregation weep and rejoice all in the same song, his voice carrying both thunder and tenderness. Behind the brilliance, however, Moore carried burdens that were harder to sing through. He struggled with his sexuality, caught between the truth of who he was and the unyielding doctrines of the church that had both nurtured and constrained him. Like many gospel greats before him, he lived in that space of conflict, where love and condemnation coexisted, where one could be celebrated for the gift and silenced for the life behind it. His sexuality was never spoken of publicly, but within the circles of gospel music, it was quietly understood. Moore's life came to a heartbreaking end in 2000 when he died from complications related to AIDS. His passing echoed that of James Cleveland less than a decade earlier, and once again forced the gospel community to face the issues it so often tried to ignore. The disease that devastated so many in the black community, and especially among gay men, had taken yet another towering figure. His death underscored the silence and stigma that still surrounded sexuality in the church, even as his music continued to ring with hope and endurance. And yet, what remains most of all is his voice, that unmistakable, soul-stirring sound that continues to inspire choirs and soloists to this day. Reverend James Moore's legacy is both luminous and tragic. Luminous in a way he carried the gospel with such fire, tragic in a way he bore the weight of secrecy and stigma. To remember him fully is to remember both the soaring beauty of his gift and the pain of the silence that surrounded him, a silence that still lingers in the gospel world even as his songs cry out, strong and unbroken, across the years. 11. Bishop Paul S. Morton has long been a towering figure in the modern black church, known not only for his soaring voice, but also for his visionary leadership. Born in 1950, he rose through the ranks of ministry and eventually founded the Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship in 1990s, a movement that opened space for Pentecostal expression within the Baptist tradition. With a gift for preaching, pastoring, and singing, Morton became one of the most recognizable church leaders of his generation, a man whose influence stretched across pulpits, choirs, and communities around the world. For decades, he lived within the familiar image of a churchman's life. Married to a woman, raising a family, leading a congregation. But later, after the end of his marriage, Morton did what very few leaders of his stature had ever dared. He publicly identified as bisexual. His admission challenged not only the expectations of his followers, but the broader assumptions about sexuality within the black church. It was a moment that revealed just how complex and human even the most exalted spiritual leaders are, a reminder that behind the robes and titles are people navigating truths that do not always fit cleanly within tradition. Morton's story underscores the tension between faith and identity, and the way public expectation can weigh heavily on private reality. For many in the church, his coming out was difficult to reconcile. For others, it was liberating, an acknowledgement that the gospel of God's love must be wide enough to hold all of who a person is. In choosing to speak his truth, Morton placed himself within a lineage of gospel and church figures whose lives testify to both the pain of silence and the courage of honesty. Today, Bishop Paul S. Morton is remembered not only as a builder of churches and fellowships, but also as a man who carried the complexity of human experience into the pulpit. His journey invites us to consider what it means to be whole in a world that often demands division, and how faith can expand when honesty takes the place of fear. 12.
Standing in front of 3 Goliaths, I'm here to tell you that God said to tell you that if you love me.
Eddie Long was a man who carried both light and shadows in his story. To many, his name evokes images of a towering presence in the pulpit, a voice that could stir a congregation into thunderous praise, a leader who drew thousands into the fold with conviction of his words. For decades, he stood as a symbol of strength, of uncompromising faith, and of the kind of charisma that made people believe God was moving directly through him. His influence was undeniable, and his reach stretched far beyond the walls of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. But behind that commanding figure was a more fragile and hidden truth, one that he spent his entire life carefully protecting. Eddie Long lived in a world where being a man of God and being gay could not exist side by side, not in the way he was taught and not in the way the culture demanded of him. So he chose silence, and silence became his companion. He poured his energy into sermons, into music, into the call of ministry, all while carrying a part of himself that remained locked away. The weight of secrecy is never light. It can weave itself into every prayer, every song, every smile offered to the world. For Eddie Long, that silence eventually became one of the defining contradictions of his life. In the public, he was the unwavering shepherd, but in private he wrestled with an identity that the world around him refused to accept. When whispers and accusations began to surface, they were met with denial and defense, but they also revealed just how heavy that silence had become. After his death, stories of who he really was began to take shape. The man remembered for fiery sermons and gospel fervor was also a man who had lived in fear being fully known. To some, this revelation was jarring. To others, it explained the contradictions they had always sensed. And for those who had walked similar paths, his story was not one of scandal but of empathy, a reminder of what happens when the world leaves no space for honesty. Eddie Long's legacy is complicated, and perhaps that is what makes it so human. He was not only the preacher, not only the leader, but also a man who longed for love and authenticity in a life that gave him little room for either. In the end, his story is both a warning and a plea that faith should never demand the erasure of one's truth, and that silence, no matter how long it is kept, has a way of speaking after we are gone.
That fire, said it's just like fire. Where's that?
Rance Allen was a voice unlike any other, a singer whose range and power could move effortlessly from a velvet whisper to a soul-shaking wail. Born in 1948 in Michigan, he founded the Rance Allen Group with his brothers and went on to transform gospel music with sound that blended traditional church roots with the grooves of soul, funk, and our /&B. Songs like Something About the Name Jesus and Miracle Worker showcased not just his vocal genius, but also his vision of a gospel that could be both deeply spiritual and musically adventurous. His influence reached beyond gospel into mainstream music, inspiring artists across genres who marveled at what his voice could do. For all his brilliance on stage, Allen was a deeply private man off it. He rarely spoke about his personal life, choosing instead to let his music carry the public weight of his identity. Yet within the circles of those who knew him, it was well understood that he shared his life with Steve Burgess, his manager and devoted partner. Their relationship was not shouted from rooftops or written into press releases, but was steady, enduring, and central to Allen's world. Burgess was by his side through the long years of touring, recording, and ministry, providing a kind of quiet stability that allowed Allen to soar so freely in his music. In a culture where many gospel artists felt forced to hide or deny the fullness of their lives, Allen's choice of privacy was both a shield and a statement. He may not have spoken publicly about his partnership, but he lived it openly enough among those closest to him, trusting the people who mattered most to understand. When he died in 2020, Burgess was there, as he had been all along, the constant presence behind the legend's remarkable journey. Remembering Rance Allen means remembering not only the thunder of his voice and the innovation of his music, but also the quiet truth of a love that endured outside the spotlight. His story is a reminder that gospel history, so often told in hymns and headlines, is also carrying the lives and loves of the people who made the music soar. 14.
The Lord puts a hook in your jaw you can't escape. And I remember
Andre Crouch was a bridge between gospel and the wider world of popular music, a man whose songs carried the language of faith into places it had rarely reached before. Born in 1942 in Los Angeles, he grew up steeped in the church, but with an imagination that stretched far beyond it. By the time he was in his 20s, his writing had already begun to change the sound of gospel. Songs like My Tribute, To God Be the Glory, Soon and Very Soon, and The Blood Will Never Lose Its Power became standards sung in sanctuaries around the world. But his genius didn't stop there. He collaborated with artists like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Quincy Jones, weaving gospel textures into mainstream recordings and earning the title Father of Modern Gospel Music. Yet for all the acclaim, there was a side of Andre Crouch's life that was never spoken of directly, even as it lingered in the background of his career. He never married, never presented the traditional image of family life that so many church leaders were expected to uphold. Instead, he surrounded himself with close male companions, men who were central to his world both personally and professionally. His mannerisms, his bachelorhood, and his private life became the subject of constant speculation within gospel circles and beyond. Many in the community believed he was gay, a belief echoed in several biographies and articles written about him, though he himself never addressed it publicly. That silence reflected the complicated reality of being a queer figure in a world where gospel music and church culture often demanded a spotless conformity. Crouch chose to let the music bear the weight of his public identity, while the rest remained unspoken. And perhaps that is why his songs feel so deeply personal even as they are communal. There is an intimacy in his writing, a tenderness that seems to come from someone who knew what it meant to long, to reach for God's love amid complexities of being human. When Andre Crouch died in 2015, he left behind not just a body of work, but an entire language of gospel expression that shaped generations. His legacy is written into the hymns and choruses still sung every Sunday, into the crossover collaborations that proved gospel could belong anywhere, into the countless lives touched by his ministry of music. The mystery of his private life remains, but perhaps that, too, is part of his story, a reminder that genius often carries with it contradictions, silences, and truths too heavy for their own time. 15.
In sadness, you are the laughter.
Richard Smallwood is one of gospel's most refined and beloved voices, a composer and pianist whose music blends the richness of classical tradition with the soul of the black church. Born in 1948 in Atlanta, he grew up surrounded by the sound of hymns and symphonies alike, and by the time he began writing his own work, it was clear he carried both worlds within him. His compositions, majestic, elegant, deeply spiritual, have become modern standards. Songs like Total Praise and Center of My Joy are now fixtures in churches across the world, sung whenever communities need word of comfort, strength, or adoration. Few writers have been able to capture reverence with such beauty and accessibility, as music has crossed denominational and cultural lines in a way that feels almost universal. But alongside his celebrated career, there's always been another story, one less spoken but widely known. For decades, Smallwood's sexual orientation has been a subject of conversation within gospel and LGBTQ+ circles. Like Andre Crouch before him, he has never publicly addressed the matter, choosing instead to maintain his privacy and dignity. His bachelorhood, his close relationships, and the quiet way he has carried himself have all fueled speculation, but Smallwood has consistently deflected attention away from his personal life, keeping the focus firmly on his ministry of music. That choice reflects both the burden and the resilience of so many gospel artists who live in the tension between church expectations and personal truth. While others have spoken more openly, Smallwood has guarded his silence, perhaps recognizing that his calling lay not in confessions, but in compositions. And yet, there are those who hear in his music the depth of someone who knows what it means to wrestle with silence, to long for acceptance, to pour unspoken truths into notes and harmonies. His arrangements carry both grandeur and vulnerability, as if the full spectrum of a complicated human experience has been transposed into sound. Now in his 70s, Richard Smallwood is revered not only for his body of work, but for the integrity with which he has lived his life. His songs remain some of the most performed pieces in gospel, beloved for their ability to elevate worship and soothe the soul. Whatever mysteries linger about his private world, what stands clear is his legacy, a ministry of music that has touched millions, a catalog that will endure for generations, and a life lived with quiet grace in the face of constant speculation.